The dust of Redemption Creek tasted of grit and regret. It settled in the lines of men's faces and coated the tongues of dreamers who'd come west seeking fortune, only to find the sun was a harsher master than any they had fled. On this day the sun beat down, with a particular fury turning the main street into a shimmering river of heat. Inside the Redemption Savings and Trust, the air was thick with the scent of stale paper and sweat, a fragile peace punctuated by the lazy buzzing of a fly against a window pane. Abraham stood at the teller's window, his broad shoulders slightly stooped, a man folded into himself by years of quiet sorrow. He was not there for a loan or a withdrawal, but for a task that felt heavier than either. He was closing his late wife's account, a final painful severance of a bond that death had already claimed. He slid the passbook across the polished wood, his knuckles scarred from a life of mending fences and breaking horses. The teller, a young man named Peterson, with a nervous twitch, took the book. "Just a signature here, Mr. Hayes," he whispered, his voice barely disturbing the silence. It was then that the silence shattered. The bat-wing doors of the bank flew open with a violent crack, slamming against the interior walls. 4 men strode in their faces, obscured by dusty bandanas, their movements practiced and precise. The townsfolk inside, a rancher's wife, a blacksmith. 2 prospectors froze like startled deer. The leader stepped forward, his boots echoing on the floorboards. He was taller than the others, his posture radiating an unnerving confidence. He carried a silver-plated Colt Peacemaker, holding it not with the wildness of a common thief, but with the steady grace of a surgeon. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice was surprisingly calm, cultured, even cutting through the fear. "This is a simple transaction. Your cooperation will ensure it remains so." Abraham did not move. He had seen violence before, had felt its cold touch, and his body went still, every muscle coiled for a threat he couldn't yet name. He watched the leader, whose eyes, the only part of his face visible, were a piercing, intelligent blue. They scanned the room, missing nothing, and then they settled on Abraham. A flicker of recognition, or something colder, passed through them. 2 of the men began efficiently emptying the cash drawers, their movements a synchronized ballet of larceny. The third kept his rifle trained on the customers, his gaze sweeping back and forth. But the leader, Silas Kane, ignored the money. He walked directly to Abraham's window, his gaze never leaving Abraham's face. "Well, well," Silas murmured, his voice a low purr of menace. "Abraham Hayes, I was hoping I might find you here." Peterson, the teller, whimpered, his hands shaking. Abraham's heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He did not know this man. He was certain of it. Silas gestured with his pistol toward Abraham's chest. "The locket," he said, his voice dropping the pretense of politeness. "Give it to me." Confusion rippled through the room. They were here for money, for gold, not for a trinket. Abraham's hand instinctively went to the chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. The locket was a simple silver oval worn smooth by his thumb over 5 long years. Inside was a tiny faded portrait of his Sarah, her smile a ghost he clung to in the long empty nights. "It's of no value to you," Abraham said, his voice rough as gravel. Silas chuckled, a dry, chilling sound. "Value is a matter of perspective, Mr. Hayes. To me, its value is immeasurable. Now hand it over, or the boy here loses his." He nudged the pistol barrel toward Peterson's trembling head. Abraham's jaw tightened. The locket was all he had left. It was memory made tangible. But the life of a terrified young man was not a price he was willing to pay. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached under his shirt, drew the silver chain over his head, and laid the locket on the counter. The metal felt cold against the wood, a piece of his soul cast adrift. Silas picked it up, his gloved fingers tracing its smooth surface. He didn't open it. He simply held it for a moment, then slipped it into his coat pocket. His eyes burning with an inexplicable hatred met Abraham's one last time. "This is just the beginning," he promised. Then turning to his men, he called out, "We're done here." Just as quickly as they had entered, they were gone, melting back into the blinding sunlight, leaving behind a stunned silence, the smell of gunpowder, and a gaping hole in Abraham's chest, where a memory used to be. The townsfolk began to stir their fear, giving way to angry muttering. But Abraham remained frozen, his gaze fixed on the empty space on the counter where his past had just been stolen. He wasn't just a victim of a robbery. He had been targeted. He had been marked. And he had no idea why. From the shadows of the alley across the street, Virginia watched the outlaws mount their horses and gallop out of town, a whirlwind of dust and thunder. She held her daughter Cora's hand so tightly, it seemed their bones might fuse her body, trembling, with a fear that was chillingly familiar. The child's thin chest heaved each breath, a tiny ragged gasp. Virginia's own lips were split, one eye swollen shut, her cheek a canvas of fading bruises that still ached with a phantom fire. They were new to Redemption Creek, having arrived on foot 2 days ago, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the terror that had driven them from their home. They were ghosts, invisible and desperate. The chaos of the bank robbery's aftermath spilled into the street. Men shouted, horses whinnied, and soon the weary form of Sheriff Miller emerged from the bank, his face grim. Virginia pulled Cora deeper into the alley, desperate to avoid any attention. A woman with bruises and a child in rags was a story most folks didn't want to hear. As the crowd began to disperse, one man remained. He stood on the boardwalk outside the bank, motionless as a statue carved from grief. It was the tall, broad-shouldered man she'd seen go in earlier. He stared down the empty road, his face a mask of such profound loss that it resonated with the hollow ache in her own soul. He seemed oblivious to the world around him, lost in a private devastation that was far deeper than stolen money. Finally, he turned, and his gaze swept the street, empty and desolate. It snagged on the sliver of shadow where she and Cora huddled. For a moment, their eyes met across the dusty expanse. His were the color of soil, after a storm filled with a sorrow she recognized. He saw her not just a woman in an alley, but the bruises on her face, and the exhaustion in Cora's small frame, the desperation that clung to them like a shroud. He started toward them, his steps heavy. Panic seized Virginia. She clutched Cora, ready to run again, but her legs were leaden. There was nowhere left to run. The man stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over them. He didn't speak, only looked at them, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze dropped to Cora's bare, bleeding feet. A muscle tightened in his jaw. "You have a place to stay," he asked, his voice low and raspy. Virginia shook her head, unable to form words. Shame was a gag in her throat. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if confirming a thought he'd been wrestling with. "I have a ranch, north of town. There's a spare room, food in the pantry." The offer was so direct, so devoid of pity, that it stunned her. She looked at him, searching for the catch, for the price that always came with a man's kindness. But his eyes held only a shared, unspoken pain. He was not offering charity. He was offering sanctuary, a quiet acknowledgement of a wound he could see because he carried one of his own. Why, she finally whispered the word fragile. "Because it looks like you've had enough running for one day," he said. He turned and started walking, not looking back to see if they followed, granting her the dignity of choice. Cora looked up at her mother, her eyes wide with a child's simple trust. "Please, Mama," she pleaded softly. Virginia looked at her daughter's exhausted face, and then at the broad, retreating back of the stranger. He was a man marked by the town as a pariah. She had already heard the whispers, a loner haunted by a tragedy that had cost him his family and his good name. And now he was a man who had just been personally victimized by a ruthless outlaw. Yet he was the only person who had looked at her and seen not a disgrace, but a fellow survivor. Taking a deep breath that felt like her first in years, she took Cora's hand and followed him out of the shadows and into the unforgiving light. 3 days passed in a haze of quiet routine. Abraham's ranch was a secluded pocket of stillness nestled against the low, rolling hills. The world felt distant, its judgments held at bay by the weathered fence posts that marked his land. Virginia and Cora slowly began to breathe again. Cora discovered the joy of chasing chickens, her laughter a sound that had been absent for too long. Virginia found solace in simple tasks, mending clothes, kneading bread, the rhythmic work a balm for her frayed nerves. Abraham remained a quiet presence, a guardian at the edge of their fragile peace. He spoke little, but his actions were a language of their own. He left a freshly whittled toy horse on Cora's cot one morning. He ensured the wood box was always full. He watched them not with ownership, but with a solemn protective vigilance. On the fourth day, a rider approached. It was Sheriff Miller, his horse kicking up lazy clouds of dust. He was a man worn thin by the thankless job of imposing order on a lawless land. He dismounted heavily, his gaze taking in the sight of Virginia hanging laundry while Cora played nearby. His expression was a mixture of professional duty and personal weariness. "Abraham," he called out, his voice carrying on the dry breeze. Abraham emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He nodded a silent greeting, his stance impassive. "Heard you took in some company," Miller said, his eyes flicking toward Virginia. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't a friendly observation either. They needed a safe place, Abraham stated, simply leaving no room for argument. Miller sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "That's not why I'm here. I'm here about Cain." He lowered his voice, though there was no one else to hear. "This wasn't some random raid, Abraham. Silas Cain and his crew, they're different. They've hit 3 towns in this territory in as many months. They're methodical, almost military. And they don't just take cash. They burn records, destroy deeds. It's like they're trying to erase something. Or someone." Abraham remained silent, his face a stony mask. But this time Miller continued, his gaze sharp. This time was personal. "He left you a message." The sheriff pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It was a transcription, hastily scrawled. After his men cleared the vault, Cain took his knife and carved this into the teller's counter. "Took my deputy an hour to copy it down proper." He held it out. Abraham took the paper, his eyes scanning the words. Debts must be paid. The air grew heavy. The quiet hum of the ranch seemed to fall silent. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The theft of the locket wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was the first payment demanded. Silas Cain wasn't just an outlaw. He was a collector, and he believed Abraham owed him something. "You know what this is about?" Miller asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The town had long memories, and Abraham's past was a shadow that clung to him, a fatal mistake that had defined him as a man to be watched but not trusted. No, Abraham answered the lie, feeling like sandpaper in his throat. But a cold dread was beginning to coalesce in the pit of his stomach, the ghost of a memory stirring from a 5-year slumber. "Well, you'd best figure it out," the sheriff warned. "A man like Silas Cain doesn't make idle threats. He's not just passing through, he's hunting. And right now, Abraham, he's hunting you." Miller's gaze drifted to Virginia and Cora once more, his meaning clear and unspoken. Abraham was no longer just protecting his own solitude. By bringing them here, by offering them shelter under his haunted roof, he had inadvertently painted a target on their backs. He could not hide. He could not run. The debt Silas Cain had come to collect would be paid one way or another, and Abraham knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the price would be far more than a silver locket. He had to confront the past he had spent 5 years trying to bury, or it would consume everything he was just beginning to think he could build. The weight of Silas Cain's message settled over the ranch like a shroud. To protect Virginia and Cora, Abraham knew he couldn't wait for Cain to make the next move. He had to understand the debt he was being asked to pay. The words echoed in his mind, stirring the murky depths of a past he had walled off. There was only one event in his life, monumental enough, to warrant such methodical revenge, the Black Creek Stampede. He saddled his horse before dawn, and the air cool and sharp. Virginia met him at the corral, her face etched with worry in the pale light. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice soft. "To see a man in Stonefall," he replied, checking the cinch. An old acquaintance. He might know something. He didn't want to tell her more, didn't want to taint their fragile peace with the ghosts of his failure. "Be careful," she whispered, her hand briefly touching his arm. The small gesture was a tether, a reminder of what he now had to lose. He simply nodded and rode out the rising sun at his back. The ride to Stonefall was long and dusty, giving him too much time to think. He replayed the stampede in his mind for the 1,000th time, the crack of lightning, the terrified bellowing of over 300 longhorns, the frantic shouts of men swallowed by a wave of hooves and horns. He had been the trail boss. The responsibility had been his. His acquaintance was a man named Elias Vance, a former cattleman who now ran a saloon, his hands too gnarled by arthritis for roping. Elias's face, a roadmap of wrinkles, broke into a guarded smile when Abraham walked in. "Abraham Hayes," he rasped, wiping the bar with a rag. "Thought you'd fallen off the earth." Abraham got straight to the point. "I need to know about a man. Calls himself Silas Kane." Elias's smile vanished. He leaned closer. "That's a name you speak softly, my friend. He passed through here a month ago. Mean piece of work, but quiet about it. Asked a lot of questions." "What kind of questions?" Abraham pressed his gut, tightening. "About you." Elias set his voice a low growl. "And about the Black Creek Stampede. Wanted to know every man who was on that drive, especially the ones who didn't make it back." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture Abraham didn't want to see. "Did he mention anyone in particular?" Elias nodded slowly. "He did. A young hand. Reckless kid full of brag. Name of Caleb." Kane asked if anyone remembered a Caleb Kane. The name struck Abraham like a physical blow. Caleb Kane. A boy no older than 20, all swagger and foolish courage, who had been riding flank that night. The boy who had been the first to go down. "He's the brother." Abraham said more to himself than to Elias. The debt wasn't for money, it was for blood. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Virginia faced a ghost of her own. A wagon, rickety and familiar, had rattled up the path to the cabin. A man climbed down her husband, Elias Holt. His face was puffy, his eyes shot through with a familiar simmering rage. He had found her. "Virginia," he bellowed, his voice thick with ownership. "Get yourself and the girl, we're leaving." Cora, who had been playing on the porch, scrambled behind her mother, her small body trembling. Virginia's heart hammered against her ribs, the old fear threatening to paralyze her. For a moment, she was back in their cramped little house, anticipating the sting of his hand, but something was different. The days spent under Abraham's quiet protection, and the strength she'd found in his unspoken respect, had kindled a spark of defiance in her. She stepped in front of Cora, her chin held high. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "We're not going with you." Elias's face contorted with fury. "You're my wife. You'll do as I say." He lunged for her, his hand reaching to grab her arm. "I said no." Virginia repeated louder this time, stepping back and pulling Cora with her. The woman who had fled in the night was gone. In her place was a mother defending her child, drawing a line in the dust. The confrontation escalated, Elias's voice rising to a furious roar, his threats turning venomous. It was at that moment that Abraham rode over the rise, the setting sun silhouetting him like an avenging angel. He took in the scene in an instant, Elias's menacing posture, Virginia's defiant terror, Cora hiding behind her skirts. He dismounted, his movements unhurried, but filled with a potent stillness. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked toward them, his presence an immovable object. "This is my property." Abraham said, his voice a low rumble that cut through Elias's tirade. "And this woman is under my protection. You will leave. Now." Elias, a bully accustomed to preying on the weak, faltered before Abraham's unshakable calm. He looked from Abraham's granite-hard face to Virginia's newfound resolve, and saw a fight he could not win. With a final sputtered curse, he scrambled back into his wagon and whipped his horse into a frantic retreat, disappearing in a cloud of his own dust. Silence descended, broken only by Cora's quiet sobs. Virginia knelt and wrapped her daughter in a fierce embrace. When she looked up, her eyes met Abraham's. He saw not a victim, but a warrior. He had returned to find she had not waited to be rescued. She had already begun to save herself. In that shared look, their bond deepened, forged not in his protection of her, but in their mutual stand against the darkness that hunted them both. The confrontation with Elias Holt marked a turning point. The shadows of the past were no longer just Abraham's to bear. They were a shared burden. And Silas Kane seemed to sense this shift, for his campaign of terror began in earnest, designed to sever the very bonds that were forming between the three of them. It started subtly. One morning, Abraham found the rope to his well bucket, sliced clean through, forcing him to haul water by hand from the creek a half-mile away. A few nights later, they awoke to the acrid smell of smoke. A section of his northern grazing land was ablaze, the flames painting a demonic orange against the night sky. It wasn't enough to destroy him, just enough to wound him, to remind him he was vulnerable. Silas's psychological warfare extended to the town. Vicious rumors began to circulate, carried on the tongues of men like Tom Harrow. They whispered that Abraham Hayes was a coward hiding behind a bruised woman he'd taken in. They said the fires on his land were a warning, and that he was bringing trouble down on all of Redemption Creek. The townsfolk, already predisposed to mistrust him, began to shun him completely. The blacksmith was suddenly too busy to shoe his horse. Mr. Boyd at the mercantile would serve him with a clipped, cold silence. He was an island, and Silas Kane was methodically poisoning the waters around him. The isolation, however, had an unintended effect. It pushed Abraham, Virginia, and Cora closer together, forcing them to rely on one another completely. The ranch became their fortress, a world unto itself. Virginia was no longer a frightened guest. She patrolled the property with a stoic determination, a rifle held awkwardly but firmly in her hands. She learned to spot a snapped twig, a fresh hoof print, her senses sharpened by the constant threat. Their evenings were spent in the warm glow of lantern light. The world outside held at bay. Abraham, a man who had forgotten how to be a father, found himself teaching Cora how to whittle a piece of scrap wood. He showed her how to curve the blade, how to shave the wood into the shape of a bird. His large, calloused hands were surprisingly gentle as he guided her small ones. My own boy. He never had the chance to learn. Abraham said one evening, his voice thick with a grief he rarely showed. It was the first time he had spoken of his son. Virginia watched them from across the room, her heart aching with a complex mix of sorrow for his loss and a burgeoning love for the man he was. She saw the father in him, the protector, the gentle soul buried beneath layers of guilt and solitude. The bond grew in quiet moments. Cora would braid wildflowers into the mane of Abraham's stoic horse. Virginia would mend his shirts, her stitches neat and careful. They began to move around each other with the easy rhythm of a family, their dialogue spare but meaningful. "The south fence is down again," he would say, his brow furrowed with worry. "Cora and I can gather the wire while you reset the posts." She would reply, already planning a partner. One afternoon, while they were repairing a trough, Cora looked up at Abraham, her expression serious. "Are you going to be my new pa?" she asked with the unfiltered honesty of a child. Abraham froze the hammer in his hand and stilled. He looked at Virginia, whose face was flushed, her eyes wide. The air crackled with the unspoken question. He knelt down to Cora's level, his gaze soft. "I'd be honored to, little one," he said quietly, "if your mama will have me." He looked back at Virginia, his heart in his eyes. Before she could answer, the distant crack of a rifle echoed from the hills, a sharp, deliberate sound that was not the sound of a hunter. It was a message. Silas Kane was always watching, always reminding them that their fragile world was built on borrowed time, and that the rising tide of his vengeance threatened to wash them all away. The rifle shot from the hills was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't a warning. It was a summons. That night, as a restless wind howled around the cabin, Abraham finally understood. Silas Kane wasn't just a random outlaw seeking fortune. The targeted attacks, the psychological warfare, the name Caleb whispered in a dusty saloon, it all pointed to one terrible truth. The debt Silas sought was not for moneyland or pride. It was for a life. The reckless young cowboy who had died in the Black Creek Stampede 5 years ago was his younger brother. The realization settled in Abraham's gut like a block of ice. He was not fighting a man. He was fighting a ghost, a memory twisted by grief into a relentless quest for vengeance. Every move Silas made, stealing the locket, burning the grass, turning the town against him, was designed to strip Abraham of everything he held dear, to make him feel the same profound loss that Silas had felt when his brother was buried in an unmarked grave. He had to tell Virginia. He could no longer shield her from the truth of the storm that was about to break over them. He found her on the porch, staring out into the churning darkness, the rifle resting across her lap. He sat beside her on the top step, the wood groaning under his weight. "I know why he's doing this," he said, his voice heavy. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face in the dim moonlight. "5 years ago, I was a different man," he began, the words tasting like ash. "I was a trail boss, respected. I had a wife, Sarah, and a boy, Daniel. We weren't rich, but we had a life." He paused, the memories threatening to choke him. "We were driving a herd north through the Black Creek Pass. A summer storm blew in out of nowhere. Lightning spooked the cattle. It was a stampede, the worst I'd ever seen." His voice dropped to a near whisper. There was a young hand on the drive. Caleb Kane. He was cocky, reckless. He broke formation, tried to turn the herd on his own. He went down first. We lost 2 other men that night. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. They blamed me. The cattle owner, the other hands, said I pushed the herd too hard, that I wasn't prepared. I lost my job, my reputation. No one would hire a trail boss who'd lost 3 men and a quarter of the herd. We had nothing. He finally forced himself to look at her, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing guilt. That winter was hard. Daniel, my son, he took ill. Then Sarah. The doctor said they needed medicine, a warmer climate. But I was broke. A pariah. I couldn't provide for them. I couldn't save them. His voice broke. I buried them both before the spring thaw. Tears streamed down Virginia's face, not for herself, but for him. For the impossible weight he had carried alone for so long. My isolation. It wasn't just grief, he confessed, the admission tearing from him. It's been a penance. I failed my men. I failed my family. I deserved to be alone. That wasn't your fault, Abraham, she whispered, her hand finding his. It doesn't matter, he said, his voice ragged. Silas Kane thinks it was. He believes I'm responsible for his brother's death. And he's come to make me pay. An eye for an eye. A family for a family. The wind shrieked, rattling the windows of the cabin as if in answer. The conflict had been irrevocably transformed. This was no longer a simple fight for survival against a band of outlaws. It was a profound struggle for redemption, a reckoning with a past that had already destroyed one family and now threatened to claim another. Abraham looked at Virginia, her hand holding his, and at the cabin behind them where Cora slept peacefully, and knew that this time he could not fail. The penance was over. The fight had begun. Silas Kane, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the ranch, watched the flicker of lantern light in the cabin window through a spyglass. He had seen the woman's husband come and go, a pathetic creature easily dismissed. He had seen Abraham's quiet defiance. His psychological warfare, the slow turning of the screws, wasn't breaking the man. It was forging him, hardening him. Abraham Hayes was not isolating himself in guilt. He was building a new fortress with a new family inside. Patience had been Silas's creed, a slow, meticulous dismantling of his target's world. But patience had its limits. It was time to escalate. It was time to take the one thing that would truly make Abraham understand the meaning of helpless loss. The next day, Abraham rode out to check the burned pasture land, leaving Virginia and Cora near the cabin. Virginia was teaching Cora how to patch a tear in her dress, their heads bent together in the morning sun, a perfect portrait of domestic peace. It was this image of tranquility that Silas intended to shatter forever. His men moved like shadows emerging from the tall grass where they had lain in wait. Virginia heard the snap of a twig too late. Before she could scream, a hand was clamped over her mouth and the cold steel of a pistol barrel pressed against her temple. Cora was snatched up, her terrified cry muffled against a rough wool coat. It was over in seconds. They left Virginia bound and gagged in the dust, her eyes wide with a horror that transcended fear. On the porch step where Cora's lesson in sewing lay abandoned was a single folded piece of paper weighted down by a rock. When Abraham returned, the unnatural silence of the ranch struck him first. No sound of Cora's laughter, no sight of Virginia at the clothesline. A primal dread seized him. He spurred his horse, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm of denial. He found Virginia struggling against her bonds, her face pale with terror, her eyes screaming what her voice could not. He cut her free, and she collapsed into his arms, sobbing hysterically. They took her, Abraham. They took Cora. His blood ran cold. He saw the note on the porch. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. The script was elegant, precise, a stark contrast to the brutal message it conveyed. A daughter for a brother. Meet me at the old mission at sundown. Come alone, or she pays the price for your failure. It was his worst fear realized. The ghost of his past had reached into his present, ripped out its heart. The stampede, his wife, his son, it was all happening again. He was being forced into an impossible choice, walk into a trap, and die leaving Virginia to face the world alone once more, or stage a confrontation that could get Cora killed. The weight of his guilt threatened to crush him. This was his fault. His past had brought this damnation upon them. I have to go, he said, his voice a hollow echo of the man he was moments before. Virginia, her tears subsiding into a mask of fierce resolve, grabbed his arm. Her grip was like iron. No, she said, her voice raw but steady. Not I. We. He looked at her, ready to argue, to tell her to stay, to keep her safe. But the woman before him was not the broken soul he had found in a dusty alley. Her eyes burned with a mother's righteous fury. She is my daughter, Virginia declared, her voice ringing with unshakable conviction. You think I will sit here and wait while her life is in your hands alone? I stood up to my husband. I will stand up to this monster. We faced this together. Her courage was a fire that burned away his despair. It fortified his resolve, straightened his spine. He was not just a man seeking redemption for a dead family. He was a man fighting for a living one. He looked into her eyes and saw not a woman he had to protect, but a partner who stood beside him, ready to walk into the heart of the storm. He nodded, a silent vow passing between them. They would get their daughter back or they would die trying. The old mission of San Esteban stood like a skeleton against the bruised twilight sky. Its adobe walls were crumbling the bell tower, a jagged tooth biting at the heavens. A sandstorm was brewing on the horizon, the wind beginning to howl through the mission's empty window frames, whipping dust into swirling, ghostly dancers. It was a place of ghosts, a fitting stage for a final reckoning. Abraham and Virginia approached on foot, leaving their horses tied in a ravine. The air was thick, charged with grit and tension. Inside the cavernous nave of the ruined church, Silas Kane was waiting. He stood near the crumbling altar, the fading light from a high broken window illuminating him in a single dramatic shaft. He held Cora in front of him, one arm wrapped firmly around her small body. The girl was not crying. She was frozen, her wide, terrified eyes fixed on the entrance. Abraham Hayes. Silas's voice echoed in the cavernous space. Punctual. I do appreciate a man who knows when his time is up. Let the girl go, Kane. Abraham said, his voice dangerously level. He and Virginia stood in the entryway, exposed. This is between you and me. Silas laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Oh, it has always been between you and me. But you see, I want you to feel it. The way I felt it. The helplessness. Watching someone you love get trampled under the weight of another man's incompetence. He tightened his grip on Cora, and the child whimpered. My brother Caleb, he was just a boy. He looked up to men like you, trail bosses, kings of the plains. He trusted you with his life, and you led him to his death. The storm Abraham began, but Silas cut him off. Excuses, he roared, his cultivated calm finally cracking. A true leader controls his environment. You failed, and for that you will pay the debt. A daughter for a brother seems a fair trade. Virginia stepped forward, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them all. You're a coward using a child to settle your grievances. Silas's eyes narrowed on her. And you are the collateral. The pretty new life he built on the ashes of his old one. It will be a pleasure to burn this one down as well. The standoff stretched time, distorted by the howling wind and swirling dust. Every option Abraham considered ended with Cora in the crossfire. He was trapped just as Silas intended. It was then that a new voice shouted from the shadows near the mission's side entrance. It's over, Kane. It's all been a lie. Sheriff Miller stepped into the light, his pistol drawn. He wasn't alone. Behind him were two deputies. Your vengeance is built on sand, Miller yelled over the wind. I have a signed deposition from Jedediah Smith, one of the other survivors of that stampede. He's been living with the guilt for 5 years. Silas's head snapped toward the sheriff, his composure shattering completely. Lies. It's the truth, Miller shouted back, holding up a sheaf of papers. Jedediah confesses your brother caused the stampede. He saw a rattlesnake near the lead steer and, like a fool, fired his pistol to kill it. The shot spooked the herd. Abraham Hayes tried to stop it. He rode into the heart of the chaos to save your brother. But he was too late. Caleb wasn't a victim of incompetence, Kane. He was a victim of his own recklessness. The secondary twist, the undeniable truth, struck Silas like a bolt of lightning. The entire foundation of his meticulously constructed revenge crumbled into dust. His quest, his pain, his righteous anger, it was all for nothing. His brother hadn't been a martyr. He'd been a fool. A raw, guttural scream of pure agony and rage tore from Silas's throat. He was no longer a methodical avenger. He was just a man whose grief had been exposed as a lie. In that moment of chaotic fury, he raised his pistol, aiming it wildly. The world exploded into motion. Abraham, seizing the diversion, kicked a loose pillar supporting a section of the decaying roof. With a deep groan, a heavy wooden beam crashed down between them, sending up a shower of dust and debris. The chaos was the opening he needed. As Silas stumbled back, blinded by the dust, Abraham lunged forward. It was not a gunfight. It was a desperate physical struggle. He slammed into Silas, knocking the gun from his hand. He grabbed Cora, pulling her free and shoving her toward Virginia, who scooped her up and scrambled for cover. Abraham stood over the disarmed Silas Kane, who was on his knees, a broken man staring at the wreckage of his life's purpose. Abraham's own pistol was in his hand, the barrel aimed at Silas's head. For a fleeting second, vengeance was his for the taking. He could end it, pay the man back for the terror, for the theft of his past and the threat to his future. But as he looked down at the pathetic, defeated man, he saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own grief. He saw another soul consumed by loss. He lowered the gun. "It's over," Abraham said, his voice filled not with triumph, but with a profound weariness. He chose mercy. He broke the cycle. As if on cue, the sandstorm began to subside. The wind's howl softened to a mournful sigh, and the dust settled, revealing the aftermath. Sheriff Miller and his deputies moved in, hauling the now limp Silas Kane to his feet. Silas offered no resistance, his eyes vacant, the fire of his vengeance extinguished by the cold water of truth. He was a man hollowed out, his purpose gone. Back at the ranch, the world felt preternaturally still. The silence was no longer menacing. It was peaceful. In the soft light of the cabin, Virginia gently cleaned a long, shallow cut on Abraham's forearm, her touch deft and steady. Cora was asleep on the cot, her small face finely relaxed, one hand clutching the little wooden bird Abraham had carved for her. The emotional tempest of the climax had passed, leaving behind a quiet, contemplative calm. "You could have killed him," Virginia said softly, her eyes meeting his. Abraham looked at his bandaged arm and then at her. "There's been enough killing. My past has been paid for in blood, one way or another. I won't start my future the same way." The weight of 5 years of self-imposed penance had finally lifted from his shoulders. He was no longer Abraham Hayes, the failed trail boss, the haunted widower. The truth shouted into the wind at that crumbling mission had absolved him. He was free. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "Virginia," he began, his voice imbued with a new quiet confidence. "When I brought you here, I was a man hiding from the world. I thought I was offering you shelter, but the truth is, you and Cora, you gave it to me." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not of sorrow or fear. "I'm asking you to build a life with me." He continued, his gaze unwavering. "Not as the woman I rescued, but as the woman who rescued me. As my partner, as my wife." She didn't need words. She leaned in and kissed him a kiss that was not born of desperate gratitude or frantic passion, but of a deep, abiding peace. It was a promise of sunrises, of shared burdens, of a home built not of wood and nails, but of mutual healing and profound respect. The ghosts of the past had been faced, and in their place a future was beginning to bloom. Months later, the land had healed. New grass grew over the scorched earth, a vibrant green testament to nature's resilience. Life at the ranch settled into a rhythm of quiet joy. The town, having learned the full story of the Black Creek stampede from Sheriff Miller, had slowly begun to change its tune. Nods replaced cold stares. An offer of help with a stubborn mule replaced muttered rumors. Redemption Creek, it seemed, was capable of living up to its name. Abraham was no longer a pariah. He was just a man tending his land with his family by his side. One crisp autumn evening, Sheriff Miller rode out to the ranch. He carried a small cloth-wrapped parcel. "Found this in Kane's saddlebags when we processed his effects," he said, handing it to Abraham. "Figured it belonged to you." Abraham unwrapped it. It was the silver locket. It felt strange in his hand, a relic from another life. He thanked the sheriff, and after Miller had gone, he sat on the porch steps with Virginia and Cora. The setting sun painted the sky in strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender. With a deep breath, he clicked the locket open. The faded, smiling portrait of his late wife, Sarah, looked up at him. A pang of familiar grief went through him. But it was different now. It was a sweet sorrow, a cherished memory, not an open wound. Virginia rested her head on his shoulder, understanding his silence. He did not remove the portrait. Sarah was a part of his story, the foundation upon which this new life had been built. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny new photograph, one the traveling photographer had taken in town just last week. It was a portrait of Virginia and Cora, their heads together, smiling into the sun. Carefully, reverently, he fitted the new picture into the empty frame on the other side of the locket. He clicked it shut, the two halves joining seamlessly. His past and his future, his grief and his joy, all held together in a single perfect whole. He turned to Cora, who was watching him with wide, curious eyes. "This is for you," he said, placing the locket in her small hands. "So you'll always remember that a family is made of all the love we carry, the old and the new." Cora clutched it to her chest, her face beaming. Abraham put one arm around her and the other around Virginia, pulling them close. They sat there together on the porch, a complete family, watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon, a quiet testament to the enduring power of resilience, forgiveness, and the healing light of love.